I'm noticing a trend. The designers standing out on social media today are the ones that are using video to showcase their work. That little extra bit of motion is the easiest way to make your designs feel premium. And that's why I'm such a big fan of Jitter. It's like Figma, but for motion design. So you don't have to wrestle After Effects to make a killer highlight reel anymore. Jitter makes it way easier. You can import your designs with their Figma plugin, and they have beautiful templates to help you get started. If you want to give it a try, head to dive.club/jitter. That's JITTER. Okay, now on to the episode.
Answering why was really important. And why couldn't be, well, because we ran this experiment and this shows a 2 percentage point shift. Well, why? Why is that? It's really important that we, even if it's hypothetical, we're not going to make decisions on that unless we understand why, because the why is everything here, right? The people who could answer why were not only the most successful, but were successful, because if you couldn't answer why, then you could leave the room and try again. Because I'm sorry, like that's the job. That's the job. The job is not reading a spreadsheet and seeing if there's a green number or a red number. Like I can do that myself.
Welcome to Dive Club. My name is Rid, and this is where designers never stop learning. Today, we get to hear from Alex Schleifer, who is the former Chief Design Officer at Airbnb. Now, a big goal of this conversation is to understand what it takes to establish a culture of craft at scale. We get into what Alex looks for when hiring designers, and we even get a glimpse of what it's like presenting your work to Brian Chesky. But before we get into the details, I wanted to first zoom out and get a quick overview from Alex about his time leading design at Airbnb.
Yeah, I was at Airbnb for 6 years, starting in 2014, around that time. And it was an interesting interview process because it lasted 4 months. I later found out that they had gone through 100 candidates. And it was good because I went in there with very low expectations and also a lot of ignorance. So I had no idea what I was up against and the fact that they were talking to all these like incredible people. Otherwise, it would have felt like a futile effort. But yeah, it ended up going great. I joined the team. At the time, there were 35 people. The most senior person on the team was Katie Dill, who now runs design at Stripe. So I got to work with Katie for the whole, time there. It was like a lot of fun kind of growing the team and defining what design at Airbnb meant, because it obviously also came with a lot of expectations because the two founders were designers. Brian and Joe both went to RISD. But honestly, like to be perfectly honest, I only really got to terms with all of that after I joined, and I was like, oh shit, okay, it's 35 people now, which felt, pretty large for a design organization, but there was a need to start scaling because there were all these efforts happening all over the company. It was a global company. There was so much. The mobile app was really, not at a place where it needed to be. There was no iPad app, and so I kind of hit the ground running, a little innocent, unaware of everything that was about to hit me. And also like dealing with the fact that I was like boss for a bunch of people who had lots of opinions, who had previously worked directly with the founders and now would have to go through somebody like me. And the company was going through this transition, right? Where the founders and Brian and Joe like didn't have as much time to work directly with the team, but at the same time also wanted to have a lot of visibility and impact on the work. So just managing that was really interesting. And so over the 6 years, we grew the team for 35 to nearly 650 people, which included, teams in China. The company is quite complicated. There's the stuff you see and the stuff you don't see. And also, in 650 people, it had everyone, including the people designing the offices, a lot of brand marketing folks, engineers, and a lot of stuff like that. And by the end of, the last year and a half, I actually ran the entire guest product, essentially, the app that you use. So I also had engineers and product managers, and the role became very big. I was, I think the proudest time as a designer working for that company and building the team we did, and seeing a lot of people that we hired at Airbnb go on to great things, like we talked about Katie Dill, Ethan is at Slack, folks like Sari built Linear, lots of kind of incredible talent and leaders that came out of those, of that team. And they're still doing great work. So it's really, I think I'm still very proud of it. Sometimes I think back at how much happened, and it's kind of mind blowing because 6 years isn't that long. But I remember the day where I was in an elevator and I bumped into someone who told me they were on my team and I didn't know them. And that was the first time that ever happened to me. And I think it's around the time when we reached 150 people. And it took me like 2 weeks not to feel, I started scrambling. I need to meet everyone. And then I realized I can't do that. And I remember that was like one of the defining moments in my career.
Even as an outsider, it's really clear the level of talent that almost was birthed out of Airbnb in this stage. And I've heard you talk about how you thought that you had the best recruiting team in the industry. So can you talk a little bit about that relationship and some of the things that you were doing to have success scaling the design team?
Yeah, so we had, I think it also all starts with Airbnb's culture. Airbnb had a really great internal culture that made it very attractive to work there. People were generous with their time and welcoming, and so that always helped. But the recruiting team was deeply integrated with the company, and we had to actually at times retrain a lot of people because they had been used to hiring at scale at companies like Facebook and Google, where specifically people in leadership roles weren't at all close to the work, in quotes, whatever the work was. And so we really spend a lot of time working with people to figure out, like, how do we get these people to come in as leaders, but also know that here, we all work pretty close to the pixel. We're all kind of involved. And that was a change. And that was a lot of conversations with people who were surprised that was the expectation, filtering, and then also finding kind of like raw talent that wouldn't be noticed. And that was done hand in hand. We had an internal brand team. So we did events that were like, maybe we were trying not to be the splashiest, but definitely provide the most value. So that would attract people, get people curious. And then our recruiting process and our culture would kind of bring them through the door. And so it was it was a well-oiled machine, and it needed to work across all these paths because our expectations were very different. Some people said like, oh, it's a little bit like working at Apple, but it actually wasn't, because culturally it was very different in some ways. But yes, like the expectations of like excellence in craft from everyone, even at the executive level, was very, very important. And I don't think we would have done that without kind of our internal recruiting team that really did an excellent job. And a lot of these folks also went out to kind of launch their own businesses and are still very successful, because I think they just learned how to pick talent out. And it's hard to kind of create a pipeline of folks when you're hiring at that speed, because at that time there was a lot of hiring going on. A lot of people had like really great companies on their LinkedIn profile, but it's often really hard to understand what they worked on, right? Like, I'm being flippant, but there were people who worked at Facebook who moved a button, twice a year. And it doesn't mean that they weren't good potentially, but you needed more signal to figure that out. And, and that's somewhat changing, but I think that's where we kind of really build a really good muscle. And I think to this day, the people that work there are just become very good at figuring out how to cut through a lot of that and pick out really incredible people.
I know you said 6 years kind of flew by, but it is kind of a long time. And Airbnb is going through multiple step changes as a company scaling during that time. So were there ways that your approach to hiring, or even the type of people that you were seeking out, were there ways that was evolving over that 6 year period?
Yeah, I think for sure. But the way it evolved actually is interesting. At first, because I was maybe a little bit more insecure about my opinions around hiring. And I think the pressures of the business realities meant that we were hiring really quickly. I think at first I adopted a lot more of the best practices that I was seeing happen elsewhere. Recruiters were coming in from different companies. And I think we hired a little bit with less discrimination as to like the skill sets that were required. And we were maybe looking in more from a talent pool that was just like more expected, right? Of people that had kind of the big kind of tech experience. And it ended up that, in some cases you would hire somebody who was a manager, but really only capable of being a manager and hadn't actually done much work in 3 or 4 years, and then would be thrown into a workshop where they had to brainstorm with a bunch of people. And that just, oftentimes it worked out, but it took a few months to kind of help people reset their expectations. And I think that over time, what we became is a little bit more discerning with the talent level and the ability to move things into production and build software at the quality levels that we wanted, and be technically curious, be good with tools, understanding systemic approaches to design, etc. Right? Because you'd have very impressive people walk through the door, and one thing they would keep talking about is scaling an organization, right? Which is great. But I was noticing that as well in the industry, that you would go to a design event, and they were like, 70% of the talks were about scaling organization and management, and they were like turning into management rather than like, how do we design and build better products, because designers have a unique set of skills in an organization, and management isn't one of those, right? That should be table stakes in some capacity. But as you're scaling, you're like, oh shit, we need a lot of managers so that we can put more people on those managers, and then we need to make those guys hiring managers so that they can hire more people. But in the end, they're hiring more people like themselves, and you end up with maybe an organization that is a little too layered and doesn't have enough people actually getting stuff done. And we moved over the 6 years to a model of like, I'd rather spend 3 times the time and hire someone at a junior level that like is an excellent IC and has a lot of potential, at a senior level that is an excellent manager, yes, but also has the ability to kind of guide and lead a group of designers, be a peer to a product manager, to an engineering manager, and work on the problem. I had this kind of philosophy around management, to many counterintuitive, which was that becoming rising up in a leadership change, I was often told, well, you change altitude, so now you see things from higher, right? To folks, that meant when you're at that altitude, that's where you operate. You only operate at that altitude. But my philosophy around leadership is you need to become kind of like a falcon. You need to operate at that altitude, but you need to be ready to get down to the ground when something happens, right? And so, and without getting the head spin of doing that, that's really hard. And that went all the way up. I mean, that was also something that Brian, our CEO, and I agreed on. Like, he was the person that knew the product best out of anyone. And you know how many CEOs, I'm sure you've met them, that are the person that is the most removed from the product, which makes no sense to me. But it also, can mean like people feel like they have a little bit less agency because there are just more eyes on the work that they're doing. But to me, the craziest thing you can do is to tell someone, hey, you've got 8 years experience designing. Now stop. Here's a management book. Now you're a manager. And now the things you need to do is learn how to read data, fill out spreadsheets, performance management. That's your job. 8 years of experience. Instead, we're going to give all that work to somebody who's got 1 year of experience. And the way we're going to tell them that they're successful is that when they no longer do the thing that they love doing. If you think about it, it's a little insane, right? Like, it's just, and I think, and people want to spend more of their time in people management, people leadership, helping grow people. That's fine, but that should be a fraction of the team. It shouldn't be the majority. It shouldn't be your career path. Right. So, we kind of started going down that route, and I started kind of using the analogy of kitchens a lot more, which is, a leader for us should be a chef. That person's still in the kitchen. She's not chopping carrots, doing prep or whatever, but she's in the kitchen. And if somebody cuts their finger, she can take over the sauce station or whatever, right? Like, that's the type of people you want on board as much as possible. And it turns out that if you hire people like that, you need less people. You can build flatter organizations. Everybody's talking the same language. Performance management is easier because everybody's kind of understands, the expectations for an individual contributor. And also individual contributors benefit from it because they're learning from people who know what they're talking about. And I'm glad, they kind of continued down that path. It was really painful at times, but I'm glad that Airbnb continued down that path. And I think it shows in the work that they do.
What makes it painful?
I think it makes it painful because there's an expectation, and I keep blaming Google and Facebook because they were the biggest and they're mostly to blame. but there was a world where you kind of create your organization in a way that it becomes a spreadsheet, and you say, okay, we've got one main OKR that we split into 12 OKRs, and each one of those gets split into another few OKRs, and then we individualize each one of these OKRs. So every individual is kind of just like a node within that system, and above a node of 6 to 12 people, we put a manager to make sure that the manager is just there to put like oil in the machine to make sure that it runs, right? And we had talks with designers saying, well, my manager doesn't even know what I do. When you're young, can show like, that feels like real agency, right? Oh, here, day one, you get to kind of push something as an experiment into the flow. The problem is you have a lot of lack of coordination around building stuff with an intention, and so everything becomes then a series of experiments because there's nobody at the top saying yes to this, no to that, and so the product just becomes a collection of experiments. Individually, people who are quite junior feel empowered because they're pushing stuff to an audience, but I think at the end of the day, the product suffers, and you can't build intention behind your product, and I definitely think it's hard to build a brand around that. And it's really hard to untangle that. It's really hard to untangle that because people get comfortable in the way things work. And so that's why I think that's painful. You're coming from another type of company and all of a sudden the process is much more like, well, are you, we used to have a kind of a criteria that I actually printed out, which is like, there's 3 simple questions that you need to answer. Like 1, does it work? Like, does it do the thing you want to do? 2, does it scale? Will it do the thing across, languages and whatever? And 3, are you proud of it? Now, the third one was always really hard for some people. It says like, well, it did, increase conversion by 1.4%, but I wouldn't say I'm proud of it. I was like, why are we launching this? How dare we put something into the world that we're not proud of? Or people would say, yeah, no, we're not proud of it, but it's only going to, 5% of people. There's still millions of people. Imagine you did something and you put your name on something that you weren't proud and you showed it to 5 million people. Would you say that's mine? You're hiding behind anonymity here, And so, it's just a lot of responsibility asking, well, are you proud of this work? And so that's just a different way of working on things.
You mentioned this idea of a product being a collection of experiments, and it reminded me of something else that you said, which is basically the lack of decision-making is the primary driver of poor retention in companies. So maybe we could talk about that for a second. What were you doing at Airbnb that created this culture of decisiveness?
I think people want to work towards a thing, something that's bigger than themselves. And oftentimes when you join a company, that's one of the opportunities that affords you is to do things that are much bigger than what you would be able to do on your own. But companies get bogged down often by the fact that they have either distributed decision making across, and then decision gets essentially outsourced to data, right? So that's one way to do it. And at some point, I think that's no longer fun because you're feeling all of your decisions have been outsourced to data. There's no intentionality. So you're not building towards something better. Just computer tells you something and then you go down that path, and computer says no and you go down the other path. And I think that over time becomes exhausting. Like the person that you interviewed that's just spent 3 years moving a button left and right. They've had huge impact on the business, let's say, but they don't feel fulfilled. On the flip side of that, you kind of try to build software with more intentionality. There's actually a lot of companies that try to operate like Airbnb or Apple and said, we're going to do this, right? There's a lot of them, but they didn't have the vision coming from leadership or the courage for leadership to kind of shoot ideas down, or more often than not, like a really slow process to make decisions. Teams waiting. Like that's the one thing that you need to be sure to do is like, if you're going to have intention, if you've got to have a bit more of a top-down view to things, you need to make calls. And oftentimes leadership then becomes the bottleneck. And look, we weren't perfect about it. And the reason that, I started thinking about it is because we were suffering from it, right? And what I tried to set up at the company, which worked reasonably well, is to say, hey, if you feel stuck and you're not getting an answer from your manager, you know where to reach me on Slack. Like just like 24 hours, you're allowed to come to me, And that motivated, I think, a fair amount of people to just come up with answers. Just making a decision it's so easy to get paralyzed about what the right decision is. Well, actually we're going to do this decision in 3 weeks because we're doing some user research to whether or not, we want to go down this path or that path. And yes, sometimes it's absolutely critical to do that. But a lot of times it's like, well, we've built a shop and it doesn't have a door, and I don't need to do user research to know that we need to build a door for people to come in. Some of these things is just like make the call. And what I've noticed through that exercise was a lot of time people were scared. They were scared of making decisions of high consequence without the safety net of saying, well, research or data said that. That's why I did it, right? Nobody gets fired because their decision was backed up with data. So that would slow down all the decisions. But if you tell them, you know what, like, offload that decision. If you're worried about it, come to me with it. I'll make the decision. I'm the one that's going to get in trouble. That's what that's why I get my pay grade and I get the title, is that I should be making these decisions so that you don't have to be the one that lives with those consequences with your boss or your team or whatever. It says like, so, escalate it, come to me, we'll make it happen. If your boss doesn't make it happen, we'll make it happen. If I don't feel confident, I can go straight to Brian. I can text him. It happens in an hour because it's so big that it needs executive support. I think that's really powerful. And then for that to really happen at scale, we did something else that was really kind of uncomfortable at times for folks who weren't used to it, which was like have executive reviews every week. So we spend a whole Friday, I think it was Friday, pretty much in one room that we set up in the company where teams would come and show work. And it would either be very early stage work, very low fidelity, idea stage, or very high fidelity, nothing in the middle, right? Like nothing that's modeled, so conceptual. And the idea there was not to kind of just critique the work, but hopefully to bring kind of like this culture of like the CRIT, right? Which came from RISD, like kind of like bring your work, critiquing it makes it better, whatever. But always to end a meeting with a decision. So you would leave the meeting, you would know where you stood. And if you had the support of like 1, 2, or 3 executives, then you had like all systems go, then just go do it. And sometimes it actually highlighted the fact that the executives weren't aligned. Because in the executive team meeting, we would agree to something, but then when we saw it, somebody would go like, oh shit, no, that's not what I thought it would happen, So design was really powerful because you could mock something up and make it real. And so it was all, the output for leadership, the main output always has to be a decision. Making decisions is the currency of running a company. And, there's 1,000 wrong decisions you could make. There's 20 right ones. Pick one of the 20 right ones and you're doing great. And it's usually, don't get too hung up on the perfect one. I still think that's kind of why, Airbnb can do some of the stuff it does.
Can we talk a little bit more about those design reviews? Like you've obviously sat in a lot of them. When you kind of zoom out and reflect, what are some of the techniques or maybe traits that designers were using that were having the most success in those meetings and helping leaders make a decision and get buy-in for their work?
I think the attention to detail was always really important. And the teams that did the best and were the most, and the best wasn't like, yes, you're good to go. I think the best was have a meeting where you come out of it with a lot of useful information and next steps that are kind of just going to improve whatever you're building. I think it was always around, it's either kind of coming up with a concept that felt really fleshed out and had answers for the hypothesis, right? Which is, so if it was a conceptual stage, answering why was really important. And why couldn't be, well, because we ran this experiment and this shows a 2 percentage point shift. Well, why? Why is that? It's really important that we, even if it's hypothetical, we're not going to make decisions on that unless we understand why, because the why is everything here, right? The why is always like understanding intention and understanding people's behaviors. And because it could be why, because it's so frustrating that people just click that button, right? That's not good. Or it could be why, because people actually feel like that we're giving them such a nice experience that, they're more likely to engage or whatever that is. But so at a conceptual stage, the people who could answer why were not only the most successful, but were successful, because if you couldn't answer why, then you could leave the room and try again, because that's, I'm sorry. Like, that's the job. That's the job. The job is not reading a spreadsheet and seeing if there's a green number or a red number. Like, I can do that myself. At the more kind of high, what we used to call the high fidelity stage, it was about having a lot of considered decisions and not seeing sloppiness. So a lot of time you would have something that's presented, but for some reason the alignment of the buttons wasn't right? And there was a box there that looked, like it was not built with the system in mind. And all of these things were available. I don't think it's hard aligning a button. It takes you 30 seconds. I don't think it's hard using the tabs from our design system. We had all the tooling for that. And for me, that always showed like you're showing this high fidelity. You're trying to wave off why something isn't complete, right? Well, it's work in progress. But some of these things didn't feel like work in progress. They just felt like oversights. And I think that when you're building something as finite as a screen or an interaction or a pattern, and you're showing this in high fidelity, I want to see like that every element of it was considered, even though it might not look like that in production or whatever. Like, just make sure that you understand information hierarchy and all these types of things. So there, like, craft became really important. And craft is not just like making something pretty, of course, but it's also like, how does this read? Is the language right? How does this feel? Are you proud of it? If this launched today, would you be proud of having it in the world? Does it sit alongside this other screen and feel like it's part of the same family? And so there we would become like really like, yeah, we would become like, like kind of like the person that tastes the dishes before they go out to the restaurant. Like, yeah, this is off, And I would say like it's not gonna work until it works, until all the ingredients are there. And you might fine tune them later, but it needs to represent what you want the experience to be. And it's so important that the language be at least like intentionally, directionally there, that, if you have a headline and a subheadline, why do you have these two? Why don't you just have a headline? Like, why is this structured like that? And having all these answers were really important. And that stuff's hard because you're sitting in front of executives and you have you have the CEO going like, this seems like 10 pixels off. Why? And I'm like, and I would have, sometimes I would take them aside, and because, not everyone would get a chance to meet with the CEO like more than once a year or something. I said, look, you did great, but Brian's only seen this for 30 seconds and he spotted a thing. You've been staring at this for a week. Like, come on, so just take this as a learning. You're not in trouble, but just take this as a learning opportunity, because I didn't want people to be demoralized either. And everything was, pretty friendly, but it's always hard getting critique, especially if most of your career, you've never gotten it. Like, yeah, ship it. And if it performs well, we'll keep it. And then you come up with Amazon.com.
I love just how in the weeds the executive team is. I think that is a defining characteristic of Airbnb. I want to go even deeper on this craft at scale, but I want to take a slightly different approach by tossing out a little hypothetical for you. Let's say that you are brought on to be the interim design leader for a Series B company. They have 30 to 50 designers, roughly. You've talked about the velocity of decisions. You've talked about this design review format. What are some of the other opportunities that you would be looking for in order to level up the craft of this new org?
Good question. The other thing that I felt powerful was cross-functional product run-throughs, like running through the existing product. Because you'd be surprised, we had a really fun one where we got product managers to run through the registration flow, new user registration flow. A fair number of them hadn't seen it in a while. And they got stuck doing a live demo of our own product, running through it with a group of their peers in the room. There were like 50 people in the room. Okay, let's run through this. And once again, it's not about shaming. It's saying like, do we feel there's an opportunity here? Are we all using the product? And people use the product, but they become pro users, right? They become new users. They forget the learning curve. They don't see the complexity anymore. They see it all as a system that's perfectly running and, delivering results, but actually kind of going through these things and just running through these flows. Because what usually happens is that you get a research team and they create a user flow, and then they get user flows and then they maybe record it and they show you, videos of people getting stuck in whatever. That's great. But like, there's nothing quite like having your own team just running through parts of the process in real time and just projecting that on a giant screen. So that's one of the kind of the habits, one of the rhythms that we would like to do. Didn't do that enough. I wish we had done that more. It was always hard to get everyone together, but we did it regularly enough for it to be productive. And then, yeah, I think like I like functional organizations in general. I think you get to just a better level of quality. I think Airbnb has become more functional over time. But then whoever's working on something, I like them working as a squad where, the engineer, the designer, the PM, whatever the team structure is, operates like we would often use the term first team. Like my first team wasn't the design team. My first team was the executive team. Those were the people I was, regularly kind of working with on a day-to-day. And so like if you have a functional organization, but then, so people have their kind of home functionally, but on a day-to-day, they work with their first team and they have like really close relationship with the PM, with the engineer, with whoever's working on that team. That was really important to us. Because honestly, specific disciplines have a way of executing on specific things, but everybody can come up with the right idea or help troubleshoot a plan. So like a lot of the thinking came from engineers, right? And so having that close relationship was great. And I didn't want to create kind of like these religious, groups of designers versus engineers, or at least try to kind of block that out because that tension is totally silly and unproductive. So yes, fine, you have a home to go to where people understand your craft, but on a day-to-day you work across functions on building the product. That's your job. Also, and this is also controversial, I would make sure that all the PM have some sort of technical background, that they're designers or engineers or know how to build product. To me, product manager is a leadership position. There's no such thing as a junior PM. I don't understand how that even happens. And I think that if you want to lead a product line and you have experience in building software in whatever capacity, researcher, data scientist, and there's so many roles, then you can bring those qualities into becoming a PM. And then as a PM, you also need to educate yourself across the disciplines. And this is not everybody, lots of people disagree with me on that. Like PM is not a career path. PM is a title that you might reach at some point if you want it.
Let's talk a little bit more about that then, because so much is happening in the broader landscape since you've left Airbnb. Everyone's talking about AI. Everyone's talking about flattening the stack. Maybe we could tweak our hypothetical a little bit. Let's say that you're coming on board as a design leader at, a company that just raised their Series A maybe, and you're kind of plotting the path. Like, how do I want to think about the org structure and the types of people that I'm bringing in, given this kind of looming advancement with AI and the way that that's going to change the way that teams work. Do you have any thoughts on how your approach as a design leader might look a bit different today?
The thing that's happening now is that there's still no kind of real knocking at the door challenge for designers. There's just better tools that you can use to optimize certain parts of the process, which is great. That being said, even though the technology hasn't really disrupted anything yet, right, kind of in real terms, the hiring plans and the recruiting plans for companies is kind of baking in the fact that it will. So what we're seeing a lot of that flattening of the kind of removing of the middle management layer, removing of a lot of, so-called junior PM layer. People that are, not directly impacting the product are being taken out. I think part of it is like an economic excuse, like planning for AI, new cost structures because people are investing in these new technologies, etc. But I think they're also like, sometimes painful, but they're also correct. If you're a product company, you should be 90% product people. And to me, product people are people who actually build product. They actually have an output. They're actually part of the execution. Then 10% can do, all the other stuff. You can have product managers for as many products as you have. So if you have, 2 or 3 core products, you have 2 or 3 core managers. That product managers can have production managers, program managers, project managers to help manage, some of the operations of it. But the rest of it needs to be people who can build. And that means that at the end of the day, if you start looking at that, you're cutting off like 20, 30% of your recruiting plan because you have a flatter organization, you're bringing in more individual contributors, you have less of an operational layer to everything. And hopefully you have a kind of decision-making process that allows people to keep moving quickly because it's directly connected to leadership who should be able to make those decisions because they have full visibility over what's going on. So I think that's what's happening now. There are companies doing very silly things around AI. I'm not going to name any names, but I had a conversation with someone who said, I can't wait till I never have to talk to a creative again and I can just ask a computer to do everything. Like there's kind of that energy out there in the world. But I got to tell you, if that energy is at the company, you probably didn't want the job at that company anyway, So it's kind of self-selecting in that process. But that being said, I would be like, make sure that you're hugely paranoid, because there's a spaceship hovering over the White House and it's, warming up its laser beam like in Independence Day. And we're all there talking about like, yeah, well, it's not that good at X, right? The fact that it's even possible means that there's so many changes coming our way. It's going to hit us in the face so hard. I think designers specifically, or product people specifically, like, build competency that is uniquely human in a way, like human creativity, or the ability to solve certain types of problems, or understanding the human condition, or get into the work. If your job is just you're really good at weaving your way within a process in the company, or using a tool or whatever, that job has no future, right? If you're providing real value, ideas, craft, an eye for what's different or what's new, then you're much safer. That's one. Then also, like, keep educating yourself. And I think creative people in general, designers are part of that, are so reluctant to adopt tools that look like they're going to take parts of their job away. And it reminds me of myself when I became so good in my, when I was starting as a designer, creating icons with 16 color palettes. Then all of a sudden, 256 color palettes came out. And I was like, this is rubbish. Like, everything looks trash. I'm never going to touch that. This is not real craft or whatever. But then all of a sudden, it was 16 million. I was like, why did I even waste time complaining about this, right? It's a reality. And people who are going to succeed are people who are going to be able to use those tools in a way that provides real value, right? Like, because they're kind of mixing those tools with their own capabilities to create something that is more valuable than what the tool could have created or what they could have created. And that's going to be important, because these things are going to create a lot of value destruction. I don't know if there's even any business there's so many kind of starter roles in design that are going to be destroyed, right? Like creating a flyer for your local bar, right? No, now it's Canva and just does the whole thing for you. Building a website for someone, that's also going to be built for you. All these kind of like low-level roles are going to be hugely impacted by that. And so there's going to be much fewer paths to entry into the discipline. So, I think, remain vigilant, paranoid, but at the same time embrace it. Like, paranoid is not saying no to this. It's learning how to use this. And I do think, like, I do get excited about technology. I wasn't excited about crypto, but I definitely think that this is like an internet level technology shift. And it will change UI, because if you think about it, if you have an intelligent computer that can answer questions and it's going to keep getting better at it, and I ask everybody to just use the ChatGPT voice thing and have a conversation with that thing, when you're stuck in traffic or something, just have it, just try it. Then you realize, like, oh shit, I can think of 50 interfaces I don't need now. Well, tabulate that data. Okay, well, actually, like, maybe 80% of people now don't need Tableau, right? Because most of it is asking questions and doing stuff like that. And companies are going to be slow to change that, but it doesn't mean it's not coming. And the concept of what an interface is will change. But good news is there's going to be a lot of opportunities to create values within that system. And creating value and finding what's valuable is like the way you succeed.
Hey guys, real quick, if you know me, then you know I love products. So I want to take just 30 seconds to tell you about 3 of my favorites. Now, anytime that I'm designing and building a website, you better believe that I'm going to use Framer. I made the switch recently and I'm never going back. Now, once it's time to animate my designs and showcase my work, that's when I'm going to use Jitter. It's like Figma, only for motion design. And every step of the way, I'm going to be using Raycast constantly. It's the cornerstone of how I use my computer and the way that I stay in flow while I work. Now, I hand-selected Framer, Raycast, and Jitter to partner with me so that I could do these interviews full-time. So if you want to show them some love, it would mean a lot. Okay, now on to the rest of the episode. Can we zoom in to the micro perspective as a way to just continue to make this practical for like the person who's listening who's been designing for 2 or 3 years? And maybe the way that I want to ask the question is continuing our hypothetical. Like, let's say that you're becoming the Falcon for a moment and you are sitting in on a interview. It's your first touch point with this candidate who's applying for like a lower level IC role. What would you be hunting for in that conversation that would make you confident that they have a high ceiling of potential to succeed in this new world?
This might sound simplistic, but I always look for like a curiosity and interest in tools and in the tooling, because that's a good place to start. Like, what are you trying out? What are you using right now? Because when you're starting out, you have much more options, time, whatever, and that's how you're learning. You're testing stuff out. Yeah, I've tried Figma, I've tried this tool, I've tried this AI tool, I've done that, because that's teaching you that this person has not only curiosity, but a learner's mindset and is interested in technology. And at the end of the day, you need people who are passionate about technology, and technology is going to change so much that you need to have people who are curious and excited to work with new things. And so I was always like, the more junior, the more like, how do you use your tools? Like, that's a very, I think, important conversations for me to have, because it gives you signal. There's no excuse not to be proficient at the tools. Like, so much of this stuff is free or cheap or whatever. Like, if that's your career, like, copy something, follow YouTube video, like whatever. I just need to know that you're getting that muscle. And then, like asking that questions around what they're excited about with the new technologies coming out, what they're looking for. I find that always very useful. And tools have always been like a really important part of my hiring process. Like, understanding how people use tools is really important. Because sometimes when you look at the output, it's constrained by what the company does, because they've used a system that was kind of like 90% designed by somebody else. But if you find at least like a signal that this person really knows how to use the tools really well and can put something together and is curious about what's coming and has that knowledge, then I think that's usually very useful, especially for junior people.
It's interesting because juniors, I feel like, are inundated with the more well-established designers saying things like, well, yeah, the tools don't matter.
They're speaking about themselves, right? Like, hey, I still like using Photoshop, so tools don't matter. What bullshit. Like, once again, to use the chef analogy, like, have a good knife, know how to use it. Baseline, just do that, right? And it's like nearly gatekeeping, and it's also like way of sometimes masking your own inability to learn new things. We were one of the first companies to integrate Figma because we were curious about tools. And that was a massive change for us. And the tools don't matter. You're building tools yourself. You're a software designer. How dare you say that? So silly. It's just tools matter. Process matters. Craft matters. And it's nearly the majority of what matters, because everything else is just fluff and it's not useful. So when I go to a conference where they're asking like junior designers to pay $1,500 to go visit them, and you tell them about how tools don't matter and how to scale teams, or that is not useful for anyone.
I couldn't agree more. I'm glad you said it and not me.
Hey man, I'm in a different industry now, so I can say whatever I want.
Maybe one more question on the AI and the tool front. I think I agree that there isn't like a dominant use case where it's like very clear, wow, we're using AI in our day-to-day roles. As a design leader, though, who does have a proclivity to be an early adopter, what are the potential use cases or wedges into the design workflow that you would be most interested in exploring AI?
Building and maintenance of design systems. Everybody thinks we're going to make a design system and that's done. But the biggest part of the design system is maintenance and iteration. And then you notice that people are working on live products don't really take the time to work on maintaining the system. So you have to hire people to manage the system. And so that, it just becomes a big operation. But I think that you could create like these linting tools that checks the app for things that are out of interface and recommend a thing that would be within the interface system, right? Just that, right? Because at some point, your app has 700 screens and the settings screen is still old or whatever. And just like being able to kind of run this nonstop will be very useful, I think. So the maintenance and management of design systems, I think to me is clearly an opportunity. The other one is, like rapid prototyping based on those systems. So you could clearly see like a way of creating a first draft of a prototype based on a prompt that's pulling from your system. Because, patterns and stuff like that, it's 90% everything's reused, right? Like we're not inventing new things. So if you have a great system, that's a data set that you can use for that. And then also like it opens up a new pattern to use that I think is very useful, which is like the conversational UI pattern. I think if you look at any product today, everybody's slapping something on and it just feels like it's a ChatGPT API call. I don't need my Ford dealership to like give me access to ChatGPT, right? That's it. But if you do it within constraints, there are a lot of places where it could be very useful, like onboarding and things like that, or customer support. So right now, kind of these very complex flows could be turned into an interface that is a little bit more intelligent. So definitely where I would be looking at opportunities that you can start with today. In the future, God knows.
I have no doubt that we could talk about just that last sentence that you said for the next 90 minutes. I only have a limited calendar invite though.
Yeah, and I'm about to hop on my podcast recording when I'm just going to talk about that. So
yeah, can you tell us a little bit more about what you are working on as a way to wrap this up here? You've mentioned game design a little bit. You've mentioned your own podcast. What do you got going on post-Airbnb?
So when I left Airbnb, I started exploring building a video game studio. I really believe that video games are one of the most potent ways to launch new intellectual property, to tell new stories. It's become incredibly expensive to make movies, and there's a lot of disruption coming with AI. But I feel video games have so many opportunities. Like they have you have different ways of telling stories, graphics, interaction, business models, publication models, distribution models, all that stuff. And so I felt that I love video games, but I also felt like now's actually kind of a great time for launching a studio, and especially as there's so much turmoil in media and we want to find ways to tell new stories. And I think there's ways we're going to tell stories with AI that weren't possible before. I think there's brand new formats that are going to be created, and I think it's very, very exciting because, I want to make art that is commercially successful and makes people feel things, and I think that's a great medium. So we've been exploring that, building out the team, building out some of the technologies, and now we're in full production for our first game, which hopefully releases end of this year, early next year. Video games are very, very hard to make. I would say it's probably the hardest software I've ever built by far. I didn't know how good we had it when I was working at Airbnb on software and thinking how complicated things were. But when something breaks in video games, it's sometimes just because the haptics didn't feel right, and now people don't find it fun enough, or that sound doesn't match, or whatever. It's everything's connected to everything. So that's very fun. Aside from that, I advise a few companies, some in the space, some in tech. And I also have a podcast called People vs. Algorithms, where me and Brian Morrissey from DigDay and Troy Young, who used to be at Hearst, look at patterns in media and technology and culture. And it's a great conversation. So we did 82 episodes. It's very fun. So very different world, but also like, I've learned a lot. So it's been fun to learn to apply these things, but also learn brand new things. And I always wanted to make video games. That's why the reason I started making websites was because I was trying to save up money to buy an engine so we could make a video game. And then, 20 years later, I was selling my website agency. And then I was working at Airbnb. So I'm back to a promise I made myself when I was 7 years old. And I'm very excited to do that.
Amazing. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing what you release, and even just prepping for this call, like listening to the podcast, it sounds great. So if you're interested in this evolving landscape of AI media and everything in between, definitely check out People vs. Algorithms. Alex, thank you, man. This has been really, really life-giving. I've enjoyed our chat. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. This was really fun. Really great. Thank you.
Hey, it's Rid. Don't forget, each week I send an email to over 10,000 designers with featured resources and key insights that you can use to take a leap forward in your career. Head to dive.club/email if you want to sign up. I'll see you next week.